Welcome to the P.A.S. Report podcast. If you're tired of censorship, outraged by government abuses, and thirsty for real insights, then you're in the right place. Get ready, because here, the fight for freedom never ends. Here's your host, Professor Nick Giordano.
What's up, everyone? Welcome to the P.A.S. Report podcast. This is your host, Nick Giordano, and I'm glad you could join me today. Make sure that you follow and subscribe to the podcast so you never miss an episode. Also, visit the P.A.S. Report website, pasreport.com, and share this episode with your family and friends, because at the P.A.S. Report, I focus on the issues that are most important to our society, to the Republic. And if I think back, in June of 2019, it was the fourth episode I did, I talked about the dark cloud of censorship, how censorship was increasing, that I was seeing the movement to restrict free speech. And I want to talk about that today, because here we are, 5 years later, and it's one of the most fundamental principles that makes America truly unique. It's our God-given right to free speech, and there is a war on free speech today. As we look around, you look at today's landscape, you have this fundamental right under assault from all angles: the left, the media, the Democratic Party, the academia, but most importantly, the bureaucracy, because they're the ones with a lot of power. And they're screaming about the need to control speech in order to preserve what they deem as our democracy. They say that misinformation and disinformation are destroying our country. It's destroying Western civilization. And in order to save it, we have to grant them more power. We have to grant them the ability to regulate our speech. And we must allow our overlords to determine what's true and what's false, because we're too dumb to make that determination ourselves. And it isn't just shutting down so-called misinformation or disinformation. It's about controlling what we could say, what we can hear, what we could see with our own eyes, and ultimately what we're allowed to think. That's what it comes down to. You hear the terms misinformation and disinformation thrown around constantly, but there's another term that many of my listeners will be familiar with unless you're new to this podcast, and that's the term of malinformation. You have the director of Department of Homeland Security, Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, Jen Easterly, claim that malinformation needs to be censored. And malinformation is actually correct information. It's factually true. But the government deems it may cause harm. And yes, you heard that right. Even factually true information can now be classified as dangerous simply because it challenges the narrative of those in power. And that's who they want to protect. Think about the implications of that for a moment. Think about it. When did the truth become something we should fear? When did free speech become something we should fear, including the misinformation and disinformation? You know, the rise of rhetoric should sound the alarm bells. It should concern every single one of us. We're being told that for our own good, the government, the media, academia, and big tech need to rein in free speech. They tell us that certain ideas, even if true, are too dangerous to allow into the public square, that these ideas could cause harm, that they could sow distrust, that it could lead to societal unrest. So they want to destroy the Constitution. But let's be clear. Once you start walking down the path of curbing free speech, the end destination is always authoritarianism. I don't care what society you're in. And you should be deeply suspicious of anyone calling for limits on our speech, especially when they claim it's for your protection. See, censorship is the language of tyrants. You want to control free speech? That's what dictators do. Now, they don't come out and say they want to control you outright. Instead, they pretend that they're protecting you. But that's only an illusion. What they are really protecting is their own power and their own narratives. It's about control, and I warned about that in June of 2019. I saw the writing on the wall. I was listening to the rhetoric. And it's easy to think this is just another political issue. You know, you're conservative, you have gripes, you're a right-wing extremist, you believe in the Constitution, you believe in the Bill of Rights. It's easy to dismiss this as a Republican and Democrat issue, that it's something that's, you know, sooner or later, the winds of change will shift, and ultimately Americans would never allow their right to free speech be usurped by those in power. But that's naive, right? And listen, I was naive too. Prior to the coronavirus, there were things I said the government would never do and the American people would never accept or stand for. And I was completely wrong. I readily admit that. It seems there are many Americans that are just fine with regulating speech as long as they are only regulating the speech that they don't like. See, when it comes to them, they don't want to be silenced or censored. And this goes against the whole intent behind the First Amendment. It's easy to accept free speech when it only includes speech you agree with. The whole point of the First Amendment is to include speech you disagree with and have to debate the issues. It's to include speech that may be offensive. That's the point of the First Amendment. And this issue goes far beyond party politics because it cuts to the core of what it means to be American. Our right to free speech, it's not a policy preference. It's part of our identity, the American identity that's woven into our society, the bedrock of this republic. And if we lose the ability to speak freely, to question those in power, to challenge the prevailing wisdom and narratives, we're going to lose everything. Without free speech, the very concept of self-governance becomes impossible because the people are no longer trusted to govern their own minds. And the government's got to be the marionette. That's what this is really about. It's about control. And I'm going to talk more about that when we get back from this quick break. So everyone, hang tight, and we will be right back. Welcome back, everyone. So we're talking about free speech, the assault, the war on free speech, and free speech is what makes the United States unique. We're the only country in the world that actually enshrines free speech in our founding documents that restrict what the government can and cannot do. And the First Amendment exists precisely because the founding fathers understood the dangers of concentrated power. They knew that for a republic to survive, that we the people had to have the ability to express ourselves without fear of government reprisal. The founders would be aghast at what we are seeing today, at how elites have turned free speech into a problem that has to be managed rather than a freedom to be celebrated. It's amazing to me because for over 230 plus years since our Constitution has been enshrined, free speech wasn't an issue. Both sides respected it. The powers that be respected it. But once ordinary people started to get a vehicle, the internet and social media, once they started to get a vehicle to have some influence, all of a sudden now free speech became a problem. And make no mistake, these attacks on free speech, they're coming from the elites. It's the bureaucrats, the politicians, the media moguls, the Silicon Valley titans who view free speech as the threat. They see it as an obstacle to their power, a hindrance to their ability to shape the narrative and control what you believe. To them, free speech is dangerous because it empowers you. It gives you the ability to think for yourself, to question their authority, resist their agendas. And the reason I decided on this episode mainly was because of John Kerry. Because I want you to listen to what John Kerry, we also know him as Lurch, I want you to listen to what he had to say about free speech. It's a 2-minute clip, but it's important, so pay attention to what he's saying.
And I think the dislike of and anguish over social media is just growing and growing and growing. And it's part of our problem, particularly in democracies, in terms of building consensus around any issue. It's really hard to govern today. You can't, there's the referees we used to have to determine what's a fact and what isn't a fact have kind of, been eviscerated to a certain degree. And people go and people self-select where they go for their news or for their information. And then you just get into a vicious cycle. So it's really, really hard, much harder to build consensus today than at any time in the 45, 50 years I've been involved in this. And there's a lot of discussion now about how you curb those entities in order to guarantee that you're going to have some accountability on facts, et cetera. But look, if people go to only one source and the source they go to is sick and, has an agenda and they're putting out disinformation, our First Amendment stands as a major block to the ability to be able to just, hammer it out of existence. So what we need is to win the ground, win the right to govern by hopefully having, winning enough votes that you're free to be able to implement change. Now, obviously, there are some people in our country who are prepared to implement change in other ways, and so that's really dangerous.
You're questioning really if democracy can survive unregulated social media?
I think democracies are very challenged right now and have not proven they can move fast enough or big enough to deal with the challenges that we are facing. And to me, that is part of what this race, this election is all about. Will we break the fever in the United States?
Now, did you catch that? Were you paying attention? Did you hear what he said?
And, has an agenda, and they're putting out disinformation. Our First Amendment stands as a major block to the ability to be able to just, hammer it out of existence. So
John Kerry refers to the First Amendment as an obstruction to eliminating what he calls disinformation. The fact that he views the constitutional protection of speech as a block reveals what little regard he has not only for the Constitution, but the American people. And you could sit there, some of you may disagree with me out there and say, oh, well, he's only talking about disinformation. He's only talking about misinformation. Well, just look at what's been classified as misinformation and disinformation over the last several years. Whether it's questioning the idea of mask mandates, social distancing rules, questioning whether or not it's safe to get the vaccine, all these things were considered misinformation and disinformation, but they turned out to be true. Now, the internet, closing schools down for 2 years, well, it turns out that we were actually right. It was really harmful to do that. That has long-lasting implications that will be with us for decades, destroying the lives and livelihoods, millions of people. So when you look at what they classify as misinformation and disinformation, well, it turns out that that information is actually true. So that's why you look at someone like John Kerry, he's a snake. Our First Amendment is not a hindrance, it's a safeguard designed to protect speech that may be deemed unpopular by those in power. A safeguard to protect dissent. And as Americans, our number one priority is to ask questions, especially when it comes to government. It's our job to be skeptical. It's our job to question the policies and the policymakers. That's our role. That's our civic responsibility. And when you don't ask questions, you get failures like Afghanistan. 20 years of war, $2 trillion spent, over 2,400 soldiers killed, tens of thousands wounded. Not a single official was held accountable for those failures. Not a single one, despite the Taliban being better armed and equipped today than prior to our invasion in 2001. When you don't ask questions, you get little Mussolini wannabes pushing authoritarian mandates. And when their lies are exposed and after enormous damage has been inflicted, again, not a single person is held accountable. Instead, we get mocked by people like Fauci going on a Sunday show stating, oh, yeah, there is a risk for myocarditis in young people if they take the vaccine, but the preventing COVID outweighs that. Now they tell us. And the virus didn't impact young people. Amazing. Amazing. Think about what their lies cost the American people. Think about it. Some of you may have lost loved ones, and they did that, but nobody's ever held accountable. And it's not to say that misinformation and disinformation doesn't exist. It certainly does. But there are two important things to note. First, in free societies, especially one like ours, open discourse through free speech is how misinformation and disinformation is challenged. If we actually had free speech, if we were allowed to challenge the powers that be, if more Americans asked questions, do you think anything that took place over the last 5, 6, 7 years would have taken place? Do you think that all these government officials would have been successful with their draconian mandates that weren't rooted in any type of science whatsoever? It was rooted in power. So in free societies like ours, we have a right. More importantly, we have an obligation to challenge the information that's provided. We don't need less speech. We need more of it. Secondly, as I always say, throughout history, governments have been the largest purveyors of misinformation and disinformation. And free speech is one of the ways we challenge the government. Without it, we lose that ability. And before you know it, dissent becomes outlawed. And you don't have to look far. Every time someone talks about reining in free speech, they're not doing it for your benefit. How do you benefit? If you have to watch every little thing you say or do because the government minders out there are going to target you. They're going to try and destroy your life and livelihood. Maybe they'll arrest you, they'll prosecute, whatever it may be. How do you benefit from restricting your speech? And I want to talk about that when we get back from this quick break. So everyone, hang tight. We'll be right back. Welcome back, everyone. So before the break, I asked a fundamental question. How does restricting free speech benefit any single person in the United States? How do you, as an individual, benefit if the government restricts what you can say and what you can't say? And the truth is, They are doing it to protect specific narratives. That's why everything is right-wing extremism today. They want to prevent any type of challenges to their power. And the suggestion that some government bureaucrat should have the power to hammer out of existence certain viewpoints runs contrary to everything this country is supposed to stand for. Everything. Kerry and the overlords like him are the exact reason why the founders established the First Amendment. They understood people like Kerry. Because the Kerrys of the world, they're doing it because they want to control you. And if we let them succeed, if we allow ourselves to be lulled into thinking that some speech is too dangerous to allow, we will lose everything that makes this country great. And it doesn't end with speech. We'll lose our ability to speak freely, to debate, to question, to dissent. And once the government begins to regulate speech under the guise of protecting the public from disinformation, it creates that slippery slope. Lurch's statement reflects a broader trend of what they're looking to do, where the elites view free speech not as an inherent right meant to be protected, but as a privilege that can be managed and revoked, like a driver's license. They want an authoritarian state where only the government-approved narrative is allowed. And Lurch's comments reflect this dangerous mentality. It's a growing trend. It's not only shared by him, it's shared by many in power. If it was just him saying it, it would be irrelevant. I wouldn't be doing an entire podcast episode on it. But we are hearing this from all corners, from the Democrats, from the media, from the bureaucrats, from academics, and even some Republicans. Just think about how Senator Mitt Romney criticized Senator Rand Paul because Rand Paul had the audacity to introduce an amendment on a bill that would have prevented the government from pressuring social media companies to silence and censor Americans. And I want to remind everyone that Kerry and his ilk are the same ones who criticize our energy usage and our way of life. As they fly around on their private jets, they want to dictate to ordinary Americans what cars they have to own, what type of stove they must cook with, what type of straws we could use to drink from. They want to end single-family housing and force us to live in 15-minute cities. They want us to give up eating meat and instead want us to eat bugs and lab-grown meat. Disgusting. I would never touch those things. But they seek to regulate every aspect of our lives. And if we give up our right to speak freely, do you really believe that it ends there? And that all of a sudden we have this nice coexistence within our society? It doesn't end there. It's only the beginning. And the trend towards controlling speech and behavior is reminiscent of China's social credit system, where the government assigns scores to its citizens based on their compliance with state-approved norms and behaviors. In China, individuals with low credit scores, they're barred. They're barred from accessing basic services and travel, education, employment, all because they engage in activities that the state deems undesirable, that the powers that be don't like. This system that China created, the social credit system, it's designed to ensure compliance with speech and behavior. Compliance to what the government wants, what the state demands of you. And if Kerry and others have their way, the United States is going to adopt a similar system. I could guarantee that. You're going to see free speech suppressed, and those who deviate from the approved narrative are going to face consequences. See, these people envy China and the social credit system. They envy the great firewall that China has created, where the government controls everything the people see. And when you think about what that would mean for us, think about what that means for our society, for our children. Today, they target what you could say about climate change, the coronavirus, even elections. Today, we're witnessing a number of states trying to eliminate parental rights. And I encourage everyone to look at Prop 1 in New York. If you're in New York, vote no when it comes to Prop 1 because they want to usurp women and parents' rights. But it's not just blue states that we're witnessing this in. We're seeing this happen even in red states where Christians are being denied adoption because they only recognize two genders. There was a case, I believe it was in Montana, where the state's child welfare services took a child because the parents refused to recognize that what the child's preferred gender was. We're talking about Montana. We're not talking about Los Angeles or San Francisco in California. We're talking about Montana. It's insane, but the intent is clear. The state is the powerful entity. And if you don't comply with the state will attempt to crush you. They want to create a world where speech can be curtailed. And they do it in the name of public safety and societal harmony. But the consequences of stepping out of line are going to go far beyond just having your social media posts censored. It's going to mean a lot more. It's going to mean a loss to services, employment opportunities, the ability to participate in public life, even maybe your children getting taken from you. This isn't far-fetched. This is not a conspiracy theory. Just all you have to do is look at what's been happening in China for years and the elites, how they study that model closely. I mean, I always bring up the article by two law professors, Jack Goldsmith from Harvard, Andrew Keen from Arizona State University, where they argue that China has largely gotten it right when it comes to the idea of governing the internet, and we got it wrong. So we actually see how the elites envy what China does. And I brought up the National Strategy for Countering Domestic Terrorism on this podcast numerous times. They laid out what they wanted to do. It's not like this is some big conspiracy and I'm wearing a tinfoil hat. All you have to do is read it. Don't believe me. Read the document for yourself. It's only 31 pages. And they openly admit it, that those who put forward certain narratives may be deemed anti-government, anti-authority sentiment, and they could be classified as potential domestic violent extremists. And all the examples they give when they're pushing forward this idea of misinformation and disinformation are more Republican narratives. That's what you see. So read the document for yourself. You don't have to take my word for it, okay? It's something that so many remain silent on. I can't understand why. I try and figure out why conservatives and Republicans, why they don't talk about this document. Why don't we hear members of the United States Senate talking about this document, or the House of Representatives? Why they've been so silent on this document is bizarre to me, because they laid out their goals. And the Harris administration, if she wins, will only take it further. This is the first step toward authoritarian control, and it always follows the same roadmap. Never changes. The introduction of Orwell's dystopian 1984, you just look at it, you regulate speech, that's it. Label dissent as misinformation, malinformation, harmful content, but in reality, it's nothing more than a way to silence opposition and maintain their grip on power. That's all it comes down to. It's very simple, very basic. And many on the left, they're going to accuse me, oh, you're pushing misinformation in this episode. But again, I challenge anyone out there, tell me one thing I said that's inaccurate. They'll scream that I'm taking Lurch out of context or I'm exaggerating the threat. They're going to justify the censorship of millions of Americans because they disagree with them on policy issues and they label them as dangerous. That's the amazing part. When you really pin these people down, when you really start to challenge them, they're just going to say, well, it's misinformation. That's all they'll go back to. They're not going to tell you what's actually misinformation. They'll just try and label you. And if we continue down this road, I'll guarantee you, even those on the left, the ones who will criticize me, even them, ordinary people on the left, they're going to come to regret this. Once the government succeeds in controlling what we could say, the next step is controlling what we can do. And you have no idea who is going to be in power a year down the line, 5 years down the line, 10 years down the line. No idea. And the frightening part is that unlike in China, where the system is forced on the people, here in America, you have so many Americans willingly handing over their rights, convinced that it's for their own good, because we have a failed public education system that never taught them about concepts of liberty and freedom. So they have no appreciation for these things. But once they're gone, they're going to regret it. Now, we need to take a quick break. But when we get back, I want to get into the heart of why free speech was so crucial to the Founding Fathers and why they enshrined it in the First Amendment, the most important amendment. They understood, perhaps better than anyone, the dangers of allowing those in power to determine what could and could not be said. They knew that once speech is restricted, all other freedoms go away as well. And we'll explore their vision for America, the role of free speech plays in preserving our liberties, and how they would be absolutely horrified at what's happening today. So hang tight. We'll be right back. Welcome back to the P.A.S. Report podcast, everyone. And I want to focus on why free speech is essential to the very survival of the American experiment, just as the Founding Fathers intended, because the attacks on free speech that we're witnessing today, it would have been unthinkable to them. Not that it would have been unthinkable. They know the government and the powers that be would have tried. But they understood that once the government could control what people could say, they can control every other aspect of their lives. The founders didn't view free speech as just another policy preference. They understood that this is the cornerstone of our society. This is the fundamental liberty that we have, and a right that if it doesn't exist, neither does self-governance. The idea that we, the people, are in charge of the system. Take Thomas Jefferson, for example. Jefferson, like many of the fellow founders, he knew that speech wasn't just about words. It was about the flow of ideas. A society that can't discuss, they can't debate, they can't disagree openly, is one that's primed for authoritarian rule. He constantly warned about this. He believed that these debates were vital in our society. And that's why he said, and it may have been a little bit extreme, but that's why he said that government power only goes one way. It only increases. And unfortunately, people are too ready to grant government more power and authority. And that's why revolutions need to occur every 20 years or so in order to keep government in check, in order to keep the people in charge of the system. And limiting speech means limiting thought. Once government can restrict ideas, they dictate what you're allowed to think, just as they control what you're allowed to say. And so Jefferson knew that without free speech, this country is finished. James Madison, the father of our Constitution, he also recognized the critical importance of free speech. He stated, quote, "The right to freely examining public characters and measure and of free communication among the people thereon has ever been justly deemed the only effectual guardian of every other right," end quote. He understood that knowledge is the true guardian of liberty. But if we can't speak freely and we can't think for ourselves, how could we ever acquire knowledge? Madison understood that if the government can limit speech, it could strip away all the other freedoms that we have without the ability to critique our leaders, to question their policies, to demand accountability. All the other rights are meaningless. The freedom to express dissent ensures that no single entity or group can accumulate unchecked powers. But today we have so many sheep that as long as the people in charge identify with the same D or R in their last name, then they don't care. But we should understand that the First Amendment was placed at the very top of the Bill of Rights for a reason. The founders didn't do this by accident. They knew that every other right, whether it's the right to bear arms, the right to due process, the right to assemble, they knew it depended on the ability to speak freely. The moment we allow speech, the moment we allow Americans to be silenced, and I don't care what their point of view is, all those other rights are now put in jeopardy. And let's be clear, this isn't about protecting speech that we agree with. It's about protecting the speech we disagree with, the speech that challenges us, the speech that forces us to use our brains and think. Franklin warned, "Whoever would overthrow the liberty of a nation must begin by subduing the freeness of speech." And his words ring true today. The elites who seek to limit speech under the guise of protecting us from misinformation are doing exactly what Franklin warned about. They're eroding our liberty, they're controlling public discourse, and it's not just speech that is being censored, it's the very foundation of the republic. We have a complicit press that just goes along with the government narratives. They don't defend the right of speech for others. They want to silence and censor anyone who disagrees. And when the founders envisioned this country, they knew it would be ugly, right? Free society is always ugly. When people could openly speak freely and debate the issues, it seems like it's a chaotic system. In authoritarian systems, you have uniformity because if you speak out, you're just killed. That's it, or you're thrown in prison. But in free societies, the process is ugly. And people are going to argue. They're going to debate. They're going to passionately disagree. But that's what makes the republic work. It's precisely through the free exchange of ideas, however uncomfortable or inconvenient they may be. It's precisely for that reason that America became an exceptional nation. I will not hand over control of speech to the government or powerful elites. I will not abandon the core principles that has allowed the United States to flourish for over 2 centuries. In a free society, we are entrusted with the responsibility of sorting through this. We are the ones that determine what's misinformation or disinformation. We are the ones that have to weigh evidence. We are the ones that have to draw our own conclusions. And the notion that the First Amendment is the threat, that's the obstacle because it allows disinformation, that's just an attempt to consolidate control over the masses. That's an attempt to consolidate control over what is deemed acceptable speech. And if the government begins to decide what ideas are acceptable, that's it. Game over. You now are an authoritarian society where dissent is stifled and only approved narratives are allowed. These people, they're the ones that pose a real threat to the very foundation of America. This isn't a partisan issue. Don't look at it through the prism of Democrat or Republican. It's a fundamental question about whether we as a society are going to continue to uphold the values that made the United States a beacon of freedom, or whether we're going to allow the elites to determine what we can and cannot say. Free speech isn't just a right, it's a responsibility, and it's up to us to defend it, even when the voices we're defending are the ones we don't agree with. Because if we lose this freedom, we lose the essence of what it means to be American. The founders knew this, and it is up to us to not allow their warnings to go unheeded. And that's why share this episode. Share it with your family and friends. Share it with those on the left. Share it with Democrats, because this is a battle we can't afford to lose. If you found the content of this episode informative, please leave the P.A.S. report a 5-star rating. Take 30 seconds to write a review on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. I want to thank you for joining me. I will be back on Monday with another great episode of the P.A.S. Report podcast.
Thank you for listening to the P.A.S. Report. Don't forget to rate, share, and hit that subscribe button. That way you'll never miss an episode. For more exclusive content and updates, visit us at PASreport.com and follow Professor Giordano on all social media platforms at P.A.S. Report.